of the Counter-Reformation in contrast to the Protestant Reformation? Go ahead, Ed.
Trent.
Pardon me?
Council of Trent.
Council of Trent? You have any idea what dates? 15 what? 1500s. Yeah, 1545 to 1563. Ed's a little slow, but we're all right. We're getting it. Okay. Anybody ever hear of the Council of Trent? Trent's a little town somewhere in northern Italy. And the Counter-Reformation, as all this stuff is going on, we study the Reformation a little bit, German, French, Swiss. We're going to go English today. There's all this stuff going on, right, for hundreds of years, actually. And even though we started at 1517, it's been going on and whatever. The Roman Catholics said, okay, they're all reforming, you know. So they started a Counter-Reformation. And so they realized they were in trouble. They realized there were problems. And so the Counter-Reformation is the Catholic Reformation in contrast to the Protestant Reformation. So that's just a quick way of understanding it. So as we looked at the flow chart of our family tree from Pentecost, there was a great schism, the Reformation. So the schism broke up East and West, so now we focus on the West. And you could do a whole study of the East. And then the Reformation breaks up the Western church into the Catholic and the Protestants. And you understand all the way through history there were true believers, and they were called this, that, and the other thing, or not called anything, or they were really in whatever. So, you know, we're just kind of generalizing here. And you understand that in this Protestant Reformation, there were the 5 solas. So here's the quiz. Ready? Give me the 5 solas. By, what's this? Through faith, by grace, in Christ, as revealed in Scripture, for the glory of God. All right, you got it. And so as Luther, I found out, who said the difference between the Protestants and the Catholics is one word. It's either alone or plus. So those are that. So the Reformation statement is this: salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, as revealed in Scripture, for the glory of God. All right. So that's what made it. One of the things about Luther is he was very, 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 very big on faith. And that would make you think he's very, very small on works, right? And yet, when you read the Scriptures, you understand there is works. And in fact, he really struggled with the book of James because it was all about works, right? And so we understand that. But here's one of his quotes. I just want you to help you to see the balance he had. Even if I knew that tomorrow, now this shows you Luther's clever ability to say things, right? Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I'd still plant my apple tree. What's that got to do with salvation, right? We're saved by faith alone. But the faith that saves is never alone. And you get up every day and you just keep doing your works. It doesn't save you, right? So that was his famous statement. We are saved by faith alone, but faith that saves is never alone. If you're truly saved, things will, so you can like the apple tree illustration or not. And he said, if you really want to impact your world, the quote goes on to say, if you really want to impact your world, then get up tomorrow morning and do something. Okay? Plant an apple tree. There you go. Plant the Scriptures. Start writing. Start witnessing. Start whatever, okay? So we're doing all of that. You can find the family tree gets really spectacularly wide and varied as you look at it through history. There's that whole chart. We're not going to go over it. But to try to find where you are in all that and whatever happened, it's an amazing, amazing thing. And all kinds of attempts have been given to show the family tree of who you are, if you're a Methodist or a Lutheran or a Catholic or a Baptist or a whatever, right? Because even all of those are split up in whatever it is. But today, what we want to start with is what's called the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and the main point of it is the Council of Trent. And so just to give you a little bit of perspective, we understand that the There was a Babylonian captivity. In other words, the Pope left Rome, all right? So he was in exile. And remember, they had 2 popes, and then eventually they had 3 popes at the Council of Pisa. They were trying to solve that split, and they ended up with the 3. It's called the Roman Schism. They were split up. And so there's this problem going on in the late 1300s, early 1400s. The Catholic Church is all split up. They don't know who the Pope is. They don't know where the head of the church is supposed to live, in Italy or in France or whatever. They ended up with 3 popes. So finally, they started to have councils to heal the schism, to reform the church, because now they're having more and more immorality, corruption, indulgences. I mean, it's becoming more and more obvious that genuinely sincere people are getting upset with some of the things that are going on. Martin Luther was just one of the many, many of them that just looked at it like, this can't be right, right? So they started out with councils to heal the schism, to reform the church, and to suppress heresy. Because now if you see an error, then you start to go over here. So now they have all this other teaching going on. So the Council of Constance was one that was to unify the Catholics, and it did. And they elected Martin as the Pope. We studied that, and no more the triple things like that. But it was also there that they burned Huss. Suppressing heresy was you burn them. You know how many people burned? It's incredible. In Oxford Square, we're going to find out today, 280 they burned. That'd be quite a fire. Can you imagine burning 280 people in one day? This is an incredible, that was just one of many. Huss was burned. The bones of Wycliffe were ripped out of the ground, burned, and they scattered all the ashes on the river to get rid of it. So the Council of Constance was that. They had the Council of Basel, which was in 1449, it ended. And that really ended. There was such persecution of anybody who was not part of the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The Hussites, John Huss, all of his followers in Bohemia, they were just so slaughtered and persecuted that finally the Council of Basel ended that. And yet, in spite of that, Pope Leo X, remember that? He said, so let's enjoy the papacy. And he just sat back and said, let's have fun. He was like, let's go do it. And so it was a very worldly thing. And so in spite of the Reformation supposedly happening, it just got worse and worse. The indulgences got worse. He built St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, and he needed a lot of money for that. So he had indulgences, people going all over the world selling indulgences so he could bring in the money to Rome. And all their councils weren't really helping much, all right? So finally, Pope Paul III comes in, and he says, we got to deal with this. You know, it's just so bad, we have to deal with it. And so he comes in, and he called the Council of Trent. So Trent, a little town in northern Italy, and the council really is about almost 20 years long. So these councils, you might think a bunch of people go to a place, they sit down, hash out something, and write something, and go home. But some of them lasted 20 years, some of them lasted 2 weeks, some of them lasted months, whatever it might be. The Council of Trent is considered the fundamental council in that era, at least, for the Counter-Reformation. So when you read Counter-Reformation, Catholic Reformation, you have to go to Council of Trent. And it solidified the Catholic positions, and so we're going to come back to number 6 there. So let's just think about the Council of Trent and what happened there. You understand that for example, the Huguenots are being persecuted so badly, and the Hussites are being persecuted so badly. The Huguenots are running all over the world trying to keep alive St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. You remember that in Charles IX or something? Said we have to kill some of the Huguenots, and so the people of France said, hey, that's a great idea. And I forget how many thousands and thousands and thousands they killed that day. They were Huguenots, you just killed them. That was a really bad day. And the Pope finally said, this has to stop. This is a mess. It's not right. We're divided. We're corrupt. There's heresy. We don't know if we're reformers are right or we're right. We got to figure this all out. So he started it. So it was a big project, the Council of Trent, because they got all this stuff going on, all right? But it's a Catholic council that they put together. And they tried to, and they did, in many ways, correct abuses. And so Pope Paul III actually was noted for correcting a lot of the abuses that were going on, the misuse of power, the misuse of whatever. What they actually had, for example, the bishops, the Roman Church had a hierarchy, pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, on and on down. So the bishops would be a bishop, for example, of a region of France, let's say. But the bishops didn't even live there. They were kind of like some of the politicians in the United States. They represent a state, but they don't live there. I remember living in a state where our senator didn't even have a house there. He lived in Washington, D.C. It's like, do you not ever come home? And we never saw him, but he didn't have to, right? So the bishops lived there, and they had no idea what was going on in the areas they were over, some of them, and they were corrupt. They were having a great time in Rome and all their little houses and whatever. And so Pope Paul III in this Council of Trent said, you can't do that anymore. The bishop has to live in where he's overseeing the church, and he has to visit every parish every year. And he has to make sure, since he's supposedly in charge of this area, that every parish has a priest who actually can read, who actually can preach, and can care for his people. You are responsible to make that happen because it wasn't happening. So you could read through it in the Council of Trent, and yet, in spite of all of that, it was tasked with institutional reform of corruption, indulgences, divisions. It affirmed the Catholic tenets and practices. When it was all done, I'm going to read the next affirmations that they made. All the Catholic tenets and practices, the general ones, were affirmed, and they eventually rejected any compromise with the Protestant Reformation, basically is the way they ended up. And you could find exceptions perhaps to that if you wanted. And so the papacy remained supreme, the hierarchy remained, et cetera, et cetera. So here are some of the affirmations that you can read. And by the way, you can Google this, or you can Wikipedia. Wikipedia's, I don't know if you ever support Wikipedia. I send a lot of money to Wikipedia because they help me so much, and so I feel I have an obligation to pay them. But they do a great job. Here's some of the things on Wikipedia. The medieval church structure, they didn't change anything. So the Council of Trent didn't do that. There's going to be a pope, there's going to be our cardinals, there's going to be bishops, there's going to be whatever. The religious orders had become kind of really, different. If you know Catholic orders and whatever, everyone was different, the Augustinians and whatever. But they kept them all the same. I mean, they could keep doing what they wanted. The Mass, the Catholic Mass was standardized at that point in 1570, just after the Council of Trent. Salvation by grace through faith was affirmed, but it had to include works. So they clearly said it was plus works, and they just made it point blank. You cannot be saved without the church, without being a member of the church. If you're excommunicated, if you're not baptized, you're not in. So they made it very, very clear. Salvation is by grace through faith plus works. That's it. Transubstantiation was an issue of the Reformation. You remember Martin Luther went to consubstantiation, and Erasmus and Calvin and some others went to whatever. And they said, no, we are right. It's the real body and the real presence of Christ in the body and blood, okay? 7 sacraments. Are there 7? Remember, Luther threw out 5 of them, and many of the reformers ended up with 2 sacraments, and they called them ordinances, and the Council of Trent says, no, there are 7, and they affirmed it firmly. So the Council of Trent is where many of the things that we think of when we think of the Western Catholic Church, many of the things we think of, purgatory, whatever, they had been practiced for a long time, but now they're affirmed, and they're just set. This is where we are. The veneration of saints was affirmed. Relics, affirmed. Images, affirmed. The veneration of the Virgin Mary, affirmed. So all these things had been practiced, if you would, by the Catholic Church at this point, but now it's in writing. We officially make it. The Apocrypha, those 13 books between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament, that the Catholics have in theirs, it was put on par with all the other books of the Bible. So at that point, they affirmed it. And so when you see it, you recognize the Council of Trent was huge. It just solidified. And the Reformation forced them to say, now what do you believe and what are you going to practice? And they said, we believe what we believe and this is the way it's going to be. And so that's what they affirmed. And you could go and you could see some other things that they did and affirm, but it tells you they affirmed it, we are it, this is what we are. But it did correct a lot of abuses. Here's some changes. The priests had to be better educated. They had many, many priests who were uneducated, couldn't read, couldn't preach, and they were supposed to be carrying on the ministries in their parishes. The Roman tradition was now more important than ever before. It was authoritative teaching. So it's not just the Bible, but the Roman traditions or catechisms and creeds and so. There was a change in discipline and administration. So now the hierarchy was a bishop, for example, was responsible to make sure the priests did what they were supposed to do. You know, churches, the parishes needed that. They did change a lot of the worldly excesses and indulgences. So that had gotten totally out of control under Pope Leo. And so now they pulled that in a lot, and bishops had to supervise that. So when you read about that, you realize there was a Reformation called the Protestant Reformation, and now there's a Catholic Reformation or a Counter-Reformation, and all of this is going on. And so hopefully that will help you. There's one other thing I'd like to point out in this whole thing called the Counter-Reformation. It is said that the Peace of Westphalia, which is a town, again, all these things are like Pisa and whatever, they're little towns. The Peace of Westphalia was finally worked out in 1648 because now the Council of Trent solidified the Catholic position, and they started making statements that you can't do anything. You remember, church and state were always melted together in that world. And so if you're a Catholic, you had to do this, or in the Catholic thing, or if you're a Protestant, you had to do that. And so they're killing people like crazy. We're going to find they had 80-year wars in the Netherlands, 30-year wars in Germany. And it's Catholics versus Protestants, and they shoot each other. They fight each other. They're dying. So in 1648, a series of peace treaties came about in Westphalia, in the Westphalian, that's a region, cities of Osnabrück, did I say that right, and Munster. And here's what happened at the Peace of Westphalia. So it's a very important date for church history because now we're going to stop fighting, all right? We're going to stop shooting each other. Religious wars in Europe came to an end. Austria and Spain became more powerful. France became more powerful. The German princes gained independence from the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman or Empire, but it was the concept that the church and state were bound together. And the Holy Roman Emperor was the boss of the secular, and the Pope was the boss of the religious part. And the German princes under Frederick III or whatever it was, and Luther, they had tried to break away, but they couldn't officially break away. But now at the Peace of Westphalia, which is in Germany, they gained independence, and they could either be a Catholic region or a Protestant. You can do what you want. And so the princes were allowed that. The Swiss and the Dutch became independent of other rulers, and Catholic rule over Europe ended. So now it's that. So you're going to find out about the 30-year war. For 30 years in Germany, the Catholics and the Protestants fought. A lot of people died for 30 years. They just died. The 80-year war was in the Netherlands, and William of Orange, and all those words and people that come into your mind when you think of that. And the Dutch, half of them were Catholics and half of them were Protestants and Calvinists, and they fought, and then the French tried to control them, and then the Spanish controlled the Netherlands for a long period of time. And finally, the 80-year war at the Peace of Westphalia came to an end, and the Dutch were given independence. So that's when the Netherlands technically became a nation on its own. So you understand that the Counter-Reformation was that. You can study it, you can read about it, you can Google it, whatever you want, but that gives you a basic overview of it. They really did try to correct the abuses, the corruption, the indulgences, the lack of teaching, the lack of training. We don't even know what we believe. They tried to do it, and they did. But at the end of it, there is now peace, in a sense, by 1648. That's an important date. But the Catholics are the Catholics. And they got it down. And the Council of Trent was one of their most important councils of all time. We have it. This is what we believe. And it's now affirmed and signed, sealed by the Pope. That makes it for sure affirmed. Ex cathedra, this is who we are. And the Protestants are now on their own, and we're going to break it up. So that's just part of church history that most of us don't study. But the Catholics did try to counter a Reformation, and they did it. And they came out stronger than ever before. All right? So that was that. So let's move on to another Reformation. Yeah, John? Yes, I'm sorry. I can't read. Wednesdays is a hard day for me to read. Thank you so much, all right? Spain was, as you know, very, very powerful. King Ferdinand and all that kind of stuff. All this stuff is going on. Columbus is going on, and all this in history is going on. But countries that were very dominating in the Catholic world became less powerful because the Catholics lost power. They are not in control of Europe anymore, per se. Yet in some countries they are. France was one. Okay? Good. So now we want to jump ship. Ready? We want to go to another Reformation called the English Reformation. So now it kind of strikes home because we as Americans come from an English background, even if most of us weren't, English background anyway. But you got to understand the English Reformation for that. So you remember the Protestant Reformation. We have Germany, Switzerland, Swiss, France. English is Henry VIII. Next week we'll do the Anabaptist, and we did, I think, Scottish already. John Knox is a little bit later. So we want to think about the English Reformation and fill in some blanks here. So the morning star of the Reformation, of course, was John Wycliffe, and he was from England. So that was part of it. So while all this, before 1517 with Martin Luther, there's all this protest and Reformation going on already, and people are saying that's not right and this isn't right. But nobody had put it together in a good form until Martin Luther, if you would. But John Wycliffe, way back in 1320 to 1384, had said, Bible has to be true, blah, blah, blah. So he's called the Morning Star, and he was English, all right? And you remember the Archbishop of Canterbury was Augustine, not the Augustine that you think of, but another Augustine. So the Catholic influence in England had been strong right from the start, but now England was almost in some ways the first to really start to break from the Catholic traditions. All right, the Archbishop of Canterbury became a very powerful figure. He would rival the Pope in the Catholic Church, right? John Wycliffe is going to write and have influence, the Morning Star. English Reformation was also influenced by humanism. So there's a guy named Thomas More. Erasmus is from England. Colette was from England, etc. Some humanists. I'll just quickly do Thomas More, because many of you have heard his name. He was 1478 to 1535. He was a Renaissance humanist, and he was a true Catholic, all right, full Catholic. He was Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor. So in England, the Lord Chancellor is, I don't know what that means, but he's kind of like the boss under the boss kind of a thing. It's a very important position. He wrote the book Utopia. Anybody ever read that? The little booklet, Utopia. It was very influential in my life in college. I thought it was the greatest book ever until I realized what it really said. But anyway, it was a great book. Shows you what second-year college students are like. I just thought it was the greatest book. Man, it was great. He opposed Protestants, but he also opposed Henry VIII's separation from the Catholic Church. He really was a Catholic in the fullest sense of that term, but he was also a humanist. And as a result of that, even to this day, he is venerated by the Catholic Church. It's Sir Thomas More or Saint Thomas More. He is one of them, right? So that was influence there, okay? We're just listing some. Another influence for the English Reformation was in 1526, remember Luther 1517, when a man named William Tyndale translates the New Testament, right? And eventually he'll translate the whole Bible. So let's think about William Tyndale. You've all heard him. 1494 to 1536, that's only how many years old? Not too old. He was an English Bible scholar. So England had some John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, Coverdale, etc. They had some really educated people there. Thomas More was a humanist and a Catholic, but yeah, the other side as well. He was an English Protestant reformer. He really bought into the Protestant Reformation. He really did. And he loved Luther and whatever. So he translated the Bible into English. And he drew from the Hebrew and Greek. So that was a new thing. You didn't take the Vulgate, the Catholic Bible, and translate it. He took the Greek and Hebrew and translated it. By the way, his work is the basis for almost every other English translation of that time, the Coverdale Bible, I don't know all of them, but the King James Bible of 1611 was truly based on William Tyndale's work, much of it. And as a result of that, he was executed in Brussels. And you understand that it cost him a lot. October 6th of 1536, he wasn't that old. He had run to Europe to escape the persecution in England, but they caught up with him there, and he was executed. So, but you know William Tyndale in the Bible. Okay, so that was another factor in the English Reformation. But the real factor is a guy named Henry VIII. Anybody want to sing the song? I've never figured out that song and how it relates to history, but anyway, that's all right. Henry VIII. All right, let's think about Henry VIII. When you think of English Reformation, you think of Henry VIII. He was a really spiritual guy, much like Martin Luther. Whoops, got that one wrong. All right. You know, to put him as the reason for the English Reformation is like weird, you know. But let's just think about a little bit about him. He became the king in 1509. He was born in 1491. And he would reign for a long time. Usually if you reign for a long time, that gives you great, great power. So we're just going to quickly hit some of the things that are true about him. In his early years, he came to the throne at age 18. He was a very devout Catholic. In fact, in 1521, he wrote, "In defense of the seven sacraments." As a result of that, the Pope gave him an award called the Defense of the Faith Award by the Pope. He was a devout Catholic, and he could defend it. He would have been the Archbishop of Canterbury, but his brother died. So when his brother died, he became the king. Otherwise, he would have been the Archbishop of Canterbury. He would have been one of the leading figures in the Roman Catholic Church. He was all of that early on in his life. He hated Luther. Luther was a heretic in his book. As far as you can get, he was as far. So you got to think of him early on. He's just this Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury guy. Hates all the Protestant Reformation intensely. All right? But he has a problem with marriage, as you know. So he married Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So he's a powerful guy because he's got a powerful wife. But they don't have any heirs, no male heirs, so he doesn't have an heir to take over. And he kind of fell in love with another lady called Anne Boleyn, right? So now he's got a little bit of a problem. I need a boy, and I don't like my wife, and I do like this other lady. And so he sent somebody, what was his name, Cardinal Wolsey, to go to the Pope and negotiate so he could annul his marriage. Because you can't just divorce. He was Catholic, you can't divorce, so let's annul it. And he had reason, and Cardinal Wolsey had a really good argument why this marriage was never legitimate, never should have been, et cetera, et cetera. But the Pope, who was Clement VII, said, no way. Unfortunately, the problem was Henry VIII and Clement VII didn't get along. So you want something, I'm not giving it to you, right? So they have a little bit of fight going on. And as a result, he refuses to annul it. So Henry VIII dismisses Wolsey, the cardinal, and annuls it anyway. So the Pope says that you can't do that. So I'm going to excommunicate you. So all of a sudden Henry's out. He's not going to heaven. So Henry VIII says, watch this. So that's how the English Reformation happened. It was really an argument over that. So Henry VIII was the key there. Thomas More which we talked about, the really Catholic but humanistic guy. He was opposed to it. He was thrown out of the government. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, eventually annulled the marriage on behalf of Henry VIII and then did the wedding to Anne Boleyn. And so that was early on in life. In 1534 then, because the Pope excommunicated him and now we break up, in 1534 they break from the Roman Church. So that's why it's called the English Reformation. They are no longer part of the Catholic Church. All right? And he has Parliament, because England back, has set up Parliament, and English rulers were not given full rulership as we would think. And he said that we need an act of supremacy. So they have an act of supremacy which says the king is supreme. He is the supreme head of the state and the Church of England. So Henry VIII was kind of this humble, righteous guy who didn't mind being called the supreme head of everything, right? And he did. He had Thomas Cromwell work on reforming things, but it never really changed the doctrine or some of the practices, but it did change. We're not Catholics anymore. We're not that. One of the great things he did, the monasteries were dissolved, and he gave the land away to the public servants and nobles and whatever. It's called, in history, it's called his master stroke. He knew how to smooth people and win people. So he took all the monasteries from the Catholic orders and churches and whatever, sold them and gave them to people who are now very loyal to him, surprisingly, and all of that. He wrote 10 articles. This is what we believe, which is the first doctrinal statement of the Church of England. He wanted the Bible to be placed and read in every church. So you're going to find he did some things that we go, that's a really good one, and other things you might not agree with at all. He came up with the Act of High Treason, which decreed that anyone who would ever repudiate him is guilty of treason and therefore put to death. Okay. He died in 1547. It's been said his Reformation was not so much a religious movement as the subordination of the church to the state. And when I want a divorce, I get it. And that's the way it is. And so that's what it is. There was little doctrinal change. He was called Nero, the Nero of England, as if you think of the Nero. He was a pretty tough guy. A lot of people died. You either did what he did, or you might find yourself burning someday. Okay, so that was that. So that's Henry VIII. You got to catch that as that. He's divorced. He's excommunicated. So he has, at the bottom of one of your sheets, you have all of his wives, right? And each of them tended to have kids, but he needed a male heir. So when you look at it, you recognize that Catherine of Aragon had a girl named Mary. Anne Boleyn had a girl named Elizabeth I, and Jane Seymour had a boy named Edward. If you also look at their names, they're either divorced, beheaded, or they died, annulled, be divorced. You didn't want to be, his wife, really. It wasn't a really good thing to be of that. So we come up with Edward VI. So Edward VI, if you look at his dates, born in 1537, 1534 is when they broke from the Roman Church and started the Church of England, or what we call the Anglican Church, or they could as well. And he's going to die in 1553. So that's not very old. Anybody do the math? Okay. He's from Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. So when Henry VIII died, the question is, who's the legitimate heir? And it was a huge debate and a huge fight, and it's going to make all the difference in the world. Is it Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon? Is it Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn? Is it Edward, the daughter of Jane Seymour, or the son of Jane Seymour? Well, through called the Succession Act by Parliament, it had to be Edward VI, and he was 9 years old. He's the new King of England. Hello, here we go. So as a result, he can't rule. They understood that. So it's called a regency. And his uncle, Edward Seymour, is the protectorate. That's the term that the English use. So it's really run by Edward Seymour for Edward VI, right? But under him and under his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Church of England becomes truly Protestant. Not ultimately in the salvation by grace through faith kind of way, but as far as they are truly broken away from the Roman Catholic Church, and all of those things are taken care of. They repeal the act of treason and heresy. Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer are now made bishops and leaders, and these are Reformed kind of guys, Protestant Reformed kind of guys. So they're under Edward VI, the Church of England is becoming really influenced by Protestant reformers, Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer and others like that. They write 42 articles, which later will be reduced to 39, but now they have a doctrinal statement. We would call it today the 39 Articles. In that day it was 42. But Edward VI got TB and died at age 16. So that threw everything in a mess. Because who's the new king, right? And you need if it has to be a male heir, we're really in trouble here, all right? So as a result of that, there was a lot of power struggles going on. And what came in was a lady by the name of Mary Tudor, or Mary Queen of Scots, or lovingly called Bloody Mary. All right, so you got the drift, whatever. So let's think about Mary Tudor. Her dates are 1517 to 58, so she's only going to live 41 years. She's from Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope had said she was illegitimate, so she was not supposed to be the queen, and on and on. It gets all confused there. And she's the queen from 1553, when Edward died, her brother dies, her half-brother dies. She's there about 5 years. She totally reverses everything that had happened under the Edward VI. And so they keep passing what's called an Act of Uniformity. An Act of Uniformity says we all have to be the same. Okay? And so this is what we now believe, and everybody has to do it. And so we have to be uniform. And so they came up with, for example, the English Book of Prayer, which is a very famous work, was part of the Act of Uniformity. But it keeps changing. There's about 5 acts of uniformity depending on who was the king or who was the queen. So she passes another one, and now the uniformity, and it totally goes Catholic. She is dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. She's reversing everything that any Protestant reformers had. And she is called Bloody Mary for one reason. She just really wipes out people. And you remember, if you get to Oxford, you'll go to this memorial. If you don't go to Oxford. It was there, she had 280 people burned, right? So she doesn't mess around. She doesn't mess around. The big names were Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, who had been under Henry VIII and then especially under Edward VI, and they were Protestant reformers, right? And so therefore, she tries a lot of people in October of 1555. In that day, Thomas Cranmer does not get burned, but Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. So if you go there at that memorial right there, downtown Roxford, if you've ever been there, on October 16, 1555, they are burnt for heresy because they denied the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That was the issue that they got them on. They denied the real presence, and Catholics believe in transubstantiation, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So the famous quote is from Latimer to Ridley, "Play the man, Master Ridley." So they're all strapped down and all the fire's ready to go, right? "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." And of course, they died that day. So there's bloody. So they went, Henry VIII, it's a political thing. I want a different wife and I want an heir. So let's reform. Edward VI, not because he was so great, but his uncle really did a great number, became really Protestant. In the Church of England was really become Protestant. But Mary Tudor comes in, Mary Scots and Queen of Scots, and she turns it all around. So where's it going to go next? Well, she doesn't last too long either. And so the next one is Elizabeth. So you remember, Edward is the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Bloody Mary's daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and now Elizabeth, who will be Elizabeth I, is the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So let's think about Elizabeth I. She was born in 1533. She was born before Edward VI, but after Mary, Tudor, of Henry and Anne Boleyn. She's the queen from 1558 to 1603. So if you do the math on that, it's a long time. All right? If you want to be the Queen of England, make sure your name is Elizabeth. You tend to live a long time. All right? She reverses all of Mary's reversals. Right? And so now she wanted to get married to Philip of Spain, and the Pope said that she was an illegitimate kid. And since Spain was very Catholic, we couldn't let their prince be married to an illegitimate girl, so she couldn't get married to the one she wanted, and therefore she never married. Therefore, she's called the Virgin Queen. All right? And so she will be succeeded by James VI, which you think of the King James Bible, he would be the one that would follow in her footstep. But for, 50 years, not quite, 45 years, something like that, she's going to be the queen, and she is truly Protestant in that broad sense of that term. Here's what happened under her rule. It was called the Elizabethan Settlement. Religious legislation passed between 1559 and 1571, while she's the queen, that intended to provide a compromise between English Catholics and Protestants. So there's something of a settlement here. We got to quit fighting and burning people at the stake in the middle of Oxford. We got to do something. So a couple things that are true about this one. First of all, there's the act of supremacy. Remember, there was one under Henry VIII who said, "I'm supreme." Parliament passed it. It's the law. I'm the head. So she does one in she reinstills it in the one of 1534, and so she's the head. She's the queen mother, if you would. She's the supreme governor. So the church is placed directly under the crown, under the control of the crown. The church is under the state. Okay. The act of uniformity, remember there were several of those, and now she reiterates one and makes a new one. And so the Book of Common Prayer becomes the standard Anglican liturgy. So by uniformity, supposedly if you'd go to any Church of England or Anglican church on any given Sunday, it would all be the same. So this is what we read the third Sunday of March. This is what we read the fourth Sunday of March. This is the prayer. So it's consistent. And the attempt was not to let anybody be this heretic who takes every church down every little rabbit hole they want. And so there's a part of it that sounds, that's good. But the Book of Common Prayer, if you've ever read it, has some really, Ridley and Latimer and Cranmer and others, were many of those guys were the guys who wrote it. And it always amazes me how biblically accurate much of what they write is. So if you want a really great statement on marriage, a really great statement on marriage, go to the Anglican Church. They nail it. They nail it, you know? And their wedding ceremonies, most of ours are based upon theirs, right? And they nail it. You can't get any better than that. So many times when I need something, I go to the Book of Common Prayer and say, wonder what they wrote. I like it. Let's go with that one. They are very, very good. So the Act of Uniformity, the Book of Common Prayer. One that's not up there, they institute an episcopal form of church government, or it was retained, I should say. The 42 articles are revised and become 39, and that's been the standard since 1571, although they've adjusted it slightly. Some that are not on there, the clergy were permitted to marry, so that was a pretty major change, especially if you were clergy. But it wasn't easy and it wasn't typical. Just like in the, I think it's true of the Greek Orthodox Church, you can marry, but if you want to make it to the top, you probably won't be. But that's not completely true even there. But typically, the celibate ones get the promotions, perhaps, something like that. They did destroy other shrines, so some of the images and shrines and so. And the bottom line is the English Reformation was a compromise affair. It was a Protestant church on a Catholic base. It's a state church. This is a quote from somebody. It's a state church with the English monarch as the head. All right. So even today, the queen, now the king, right, is the head. And so when you become the queen or the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury has to do the ceremony and do the thing, and it's all connected, right? So you have probably been in America. We typically call them the Anglican Church, because the Church of England in other places doesn't sound like a good thing. This is the Church of England in Phoenix. No, we're the Anglican Church. So, but either way, you could use it that way. It's all over the world, and it tends to look a lot more like a Catholic church. If you just go in and be a part of it, it just looks a lot like it, and yet it's not. Okay, so that's different. Just like the Lutherans, remember Luther said, we don't move anything unless the Bible tells us we have to, remember? So we're going to stay Catholic as much as we can, but when it says we have to, we will. So a Lutheran church looks a lot more like a Catholic church than some of the churches you and I have been in, right? And the Anglican Church did that as well. So how many want to be part of the English Reformation? Well, there really were great men in it. Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer, Tyndale, of course, started it, Wycliffe. I mean, there were always some great things, but when it was all done, you're like, I'm not so sure you really left too much. Doctrinally, they changed some things. It tended to be more of a compromise affair and whatever. The result of that was, the last thing we want to study today is what's called the English dissenters. So if you're something of a genuine, serious person, there are some things going on, like Henry VIII. You want him to run the show? He's my spiritual leader. Like, I don't think so. Then Bloody Mary, she's my spiritual leader, or whatever. You know, there was always through this, people are like, I don't want this. They became known as the dissenters. Can you figure out why? All right. There's two ways. We talked about this early on in church history. When you see something going wrong, all right, let's say you saw New Hope Fellowship going wrong, what would you do? Well, the first thing you try to do is purify it. And we point it out and say, no, we can't do that, or we should do that, or whatever. But you don't abandon it. You just say, I don't think that's right. And that would be your first attempt, right? But if it keeps going, there's a point, and probably everybody has a different line where my line is, right? But there's a point when I just got to leave. All right, you're not going to change? I have to leave. Does that not make sense? That's just the logical. And you see that in church history all the time. There's almost always, even in the Protestant Reformation, the Luthers and so, their first attempt was to purify from within. They didn't hate the church. They loved the church. They wanted to purify it. They just couldn't live with this and this and this and this and whatever. So in the English Reformation, really didn't settle it for some. Anybody here ever read Pilgrim's Progress? All right, John Bunyan. John Milton wrote a book called Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, 2 books. Richard Baxter, the great, great preacher, Richard Baxter. I preach as a dying man to dying men. I preach as one who is never sure that I'll ever preach again. I mean, he must have been quite a preacher. So you have all the Puritans. So when you study the dissenters, there are, first of all, the Puritans, and you have heard about them from our American history classes when you were a kid growing up, right? Who came to America. They were Puritans, many of them, right? So the English Protestants in the 16th and 17th century, the 16th century would be 1500s there, 1600s, who sought to rid the Church of England of what they considered Catholic practices. In other words, the Church of England had not fully reformed in their mind. So they were trying to purify it. And they were trying to that's not right. That's not right. We're going to change it. And they became known as the Puritans, such as this: the abolishment of forms, custom, and certain ceremonies that seemed to still be very, very Catholic to them. They believed that every parish should have a pastor who can preach, and he had to preach the Bible. And they didn't see that. And many of the parishes had pastors who couldn't preach and didn't preach from the Bible. So they said, not good. The office of bishop should be annulled. Why should he be better than anybody else, right? All ministers should be put on equal footing. They believed in the separation of church and state. Why should the king be the act of supremacy? Why should he be the head of the church? You know, and why should the church have to do what the state says? So they believed and that's where, as you know, in American history, we believe in separation of church and state. Where did we get that, right? So you have to study English separation and Reformation. They tried to reform from within, that's to purify, and that's why they were called the Puritans. So early on in the 1500s and 1600s, those guys were called the Puritans. Here's a famous picture of whatever it is, number 12 or whatever it is, of the Puritans, the early Puritans. John Owens, Richard Baxter are two of the famous names. You've probably read the works of John Owens. They tended to be very, you read them and you go, I like that. I like that. You love John Owens. You'll love Richard Baxter. They're great Bible teachers, most of them, all of them really. So you'll love them as well. So there were the Puritans. But eventually, that wasn't working. Right? It wasn't really working. So you have another group called the Separatists. In some ways, the Puritans became a separatist. In some ways, the Puritans are distinct from the separatists, and you got to try to figure that out. So these are English Protestants in the 1600s and 1700s who separated from the Church of England. They are also called dissenters. They opposed state interference in religious matters. Many of them migrated to the New World, so Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were also called Congregationalists because they believed in congregational form of government. So don't misunderstand that. The congregational churches in America today get their name from this group. But if you go to a congregational church in America today, typically you'll probably have a lesbian pastor. They're very liberal, very, very liberal, typically today. So, but they had roots in the Puritans and ultimately the Separatists. They were called Congregationalists or Independents. When I said at the beginning, and we'll go here next week, these Puritans who became Separatists, or two different groups, however you want to look at it, they were made up of they're all over the charts. All right? So they became known as the Anabaptist, the Baptist, the Barrowists, the Behemists, the Brownists, the Diggers, the Enthusiasts. So all these different groups, the Quakers, the Shakers. Anybody ever see the Shakers? There's a group of Shakers in New York State that, you know, Sabbatarians in little towns in New York State. On one side it would be First Baptist Church, on the other side it's Seventh-day Baptist Church. They're right across the street from each other. So some meet on Saturday, some meet on Sunday. Sabbatarians, the Seekers, the Socinians, the Ranters. Don't know what that would mean. But I have a guess. The Monarchists, and that's just part of the list of groups that were the dissenters. And when you dissent from what's there, you tend to, you know, each take your little route and go some way. But they tend to, all that group somehow have some things in common, and they're called the Separatists. You remember the dissenters in 1620 were the Separatists at Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, 29, the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you study that in history. Let me just fill in some blanks for you here. James is set himself sternly against the Puritans, the King James Version guy. He hated Puritans. The Puritans gained a majority in Parliament And they began house cleaning, and Oliver Cromwell, remember the name Oliver Cromwell? Have you ever studied his history? It's a totally intriguing guy. He led the Puritans. He was quite a warrior. He killed a lot of people in the name of Jesus Christ. A lot of people died. The Westminster Assembly led to the Westminster Confession. We have all heard of that. Probably you've even read it. Cromwell became the Lord Protectorate. Charles II was brought back to England, and he restored it. So there's always this thing going on between who's in charge, who's the boss. Is it the Church of England? Can the dissenters survive? Parliament packed the next new law of uniformity. So England always does this. We're all going to be the same. So they've been doing this again and again and again under Henry VIII and Mary Tudor and Edward VI and whatever. Now they do it again. They had 600 changes to the prayer book, and every one was against the Puritans. You know, the Puritans says every church has to have a preacher who can preach the Bible. And you remember, it was some of the early guys who you might not like who said every church had to have a Bible on a stand. So all the people of the congregation at any time, the doors were always open, could come in and read the Bible. All right, so remember, who was it, said, I want to translate, or Tyndale, I think, I want to translate the Bible so every plowman, you know, in England can read it. I want everybody to read the Bible. So that kind of throws a lot of stuff at you real fast, right? And all this is going on, and after a while, I'm totally confused, except it helps me to understand why we ended up where we are. So then the question is, what did you learn? Anything?
A lot of confusion.
Yes, there were. They were all trying to figure it out. There were good guys and bad guys. Nothing new under the sun. Okay. So one of the main tenets of the separatists who became the Anabaptists and the Baptist movement. And when I use the word Baptist, you understand if you're not Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, whatever, the rest of us are Baptists, right? Whether you call yourself a Baptist or not. In church history, that refers to the Baptistic group. And I had a list there, the Quakers and the Shakers and the whatever, right? And there are Baptists with Baptist on their name, and then there's Baptists that doesn't have Baptist on their name. In the broad spectrum of that, the one thing that is a Baptist distinctive is soul liberty. Romans. Each man, as he's convinced in his own mind by the reading of Scripture, each man is responsible by the reading of Scripture to figure out what it says, and that's where you have to live. And there's no pope, there's no cardinal, there's no bishop, there's no priest, there's no pastor, there's no church who tells you what you have to believe and why you have to believe it. That it is your responsibility to read the Scriptures. It is your responsibility to check out what anybody says. And if it's Henry VIII, you better check it out with the Bible. If it's Hugh Latimer, check it out with the Bible. If it's Martin Luther, check it out with the Bible. And so that's called soul liberty. That does not mean you get to believe anything you want. Oh, I believe that. What do you believe? I believe this. So let's believe that. No, it's not that at all. It means you have to search the Scriptures, understand them. Now, you can read other people. All of us we learn from other people, right? So we learn from all kinds of people. But at the end of the day, I'm responsible to understand it the best I can, and that's where I have to live. And if I am different than you, so be it. Doesn't mean we have to shoot each other. Doesn't mean we can't enjoy our fellowship together. But it does mean I have to believe what I believe. And you have to believe what you believe. And hopefully we both run to the Scriptures to find it. And I am of conviction that if I genuinely do that and surrender to the Lord, He will make sure I get in the right place. Not always, because sometimes I have a little bit of a will. But anyway, just imagine if we all surrendered to the Lord, we'd probably find the same place. All right, next week we'll try to do the Anabaptist movement, and we'll go from there. Yes, or you're just getting your glasses. I thought you had a question. Comment. Did you learn anything, Maureen? Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, if you go to Waco, Texas, there's an Anabaptist heritage farm.
Oh.
And they show you all the old ways of doing things.
Sure.
Looming, pottery.
Sure.
And it's just wonderful.
Yeah. So the Anabaptists we tend to put with the Amish and the Mennonites.